clutter isn't a storage problem. It's an entry problem. And there is a very specific difference between those two things. A storage problem needs more bins, more shelves, more places to put what you already have. An entry problem needs something Japan has quietly practiced for generations: 7 rules that stop an object from ever settling into your home in the first place, instead of fighting it once it already has. 7 rules. None of them involve a weekend decluttering marathon, a donation pile, or the exhausting process of sorting through years of accumulated belongings all at once. Every single one operates earlier than that, at the exact moment something is about to enter your home, which is why a household that actually uses these rules rarely needs a big decluttering session at all. There's simply never enough accumulated clutter to require one. Stay with me until rule number 7, because number 7 is the underlying principle tying the other 6 together, the one idea that, once you understand it, changes where you focus your entire decluttering effort from now on. But first, rule number 3 is the one that's going to surprise you, because it doesn't ask you to decide anything difficult in the moment at all. It gives you an entire week to decide instead, and that single delay turns out to prevent more clutter than almost any decision rule on this list. Let's begin. Most of us think about decluttering the wrong way. We treat it as an event, the big cleanout, scheduled for a free weekend, where years of accumulated objects finally get sorted, donated, or thrown away all at once. It works, temporarily. Then the same accumulation process that created the mess in the first place starts right back up the following week, and within a few months, much of what was cleared has quietly been replaced. Japan doesn't approach clutter as something to periodically clean up. There's a concept behind this called danshari, refusing what you don't need, discarding what's excess, and separating yourself from unnecessary attachment to objects. But the part of danshari most people miss is that it's fundamentally about the ongoing relationship with acquisition, not a single sorting event. And there's madanai, a sense of regret over waste, applied here specifically to the waste of bringing something into your home that never had a real purpose or place to begin with. 7 rules. Each one intervenes at the moment an object is about to enter your space, rather than waiting to deal with it after it's already settled in. Let's go through every single one. Rule number 1. Nothing enters the home without a predetermined place to live. You probably assumed that where something goes is a decision you can figure out after you bought it, bring it home, find a spot for it eventually, deal with the details later. Stay with me, because this exact assumption is one of the single biggest sources of ongoing clutter, and it happens at the moment of purchase, long before the item ever physically enters your home. Here's the mechanism. An object without a predetermined home doesn't disappear once it enters your space. It becomes what organizational research on clutter formation calls a floating item, something that gets set down wherever is momentarily convenient, moved a few times as it's rediscovered and repositioned, and gradually becomes a permanent fixture of visual clutter simply because no decision about its actual location was ever made. Multiply this by dozens of purchases a year, each one becoming its own small floating item, and a household accumulates a slow, steady stream of undecided clutter without a single dramatic overspending event ever being to blame. The rule itself is simple to apply at the point of purchase. Before buying something, know specifically where it will live once it's home. If there's no clear answer, that's meaningful information. Either the item genuinely doesn't have a place in your home yet, or something currently occupying that place needs to leave first. The shift, the same item, purchased only once its exact home is already decided, never becomes a floating piece of clutter drifting through your space. The decision that usually gets deferred until after the mess has already started gets made instead at the one moment it costs nothing to make correctly. That is rule number 1. Now, rule number 2 is where this gets interesting, because it addresses what happens in the gap between an item entering your home and actually being put away. Rule number 2. New items are used or placed in their home within 24 hours, never left in a temporary spot. Most people, even with the best intentions, set a new purchase down for now the moment they get home, on a counter, a chair, the floor near the door, intending to deal with it properly later. This 24-hour rule targets exactly that gap, because the gap itself is where clutter is actually born. Here's the mechanism. A temporary spot has a well-documented tendency to become permanent, precisely because nothing about it ever forces a decision. The item is out of the way enough not to be urgent, but present enough to be forgotten as an active task. Behavioral research on procrastinated decisions has found that tasks without a forcing deadline are disproportionately likely to be indefinitely postponed compared to tasks with even a loosely enforced time limit. A firm, self-imposed 24-hour rule creates exactly this kind of forcing function. The item either goes to its predetermined home, or, if it turns out there isn't a good one after all, that becomes immediately obvious rather than being masked by weeks of "I'll deal with it later." The shift, the same newly purchased item, placed in its home within 24 hours instead of left in an open-ended temporary spot, never gets the chance to become one of the dozens of small, forgotten pieces of clutter that accumulate specifically in that unstructured, undecided gap between purchase and proper placement. That is rule number 2. Now, rule number 3, the one I mentioned at the very beginning. Stay right here, because this rule doesn't ask you to make a hard decision immediately at all. Rule number 3. Genuinely undecided items go into a visible, one-week decision box, never straight into permanent storage. Slow down here, because I know what you're thinking, that this sounds like the opposite of decluttering, giving an undecided item more time rather than forcing an immediate choice. Here's why this specific delay actually prevents more clutter than an immediate decision would. Here's the mechanism. Decisions made under uncertainty, particularly about sentimental or ambiguous items, are disproportionately likely to default toward "keep it, just in case," a well-documented bias where the discomfort of potential future regret outweighs the actual, ongoing cost of keeping something you don't need. Forcing an immediate keep or discard decision on a genuinely uncertain item tends to produce more keep decisions than the item actually warrants, simply because immediate uncertainty defaults to caution. A visible, physical one-week decision box changes the mechanism entirely. The item is out of sight from daily life, but not gone, and after a week without being retrieved or missed, the answer to "do I actually need this" tends to become obvious in a way it never was in the anxious, uncertain moment right after deciding to keep or discard it. The shift, the same undecided item, forced into an immediate keep or discard decision, is disproportionately likely to be kept out of uncertainty alone. Given 1 week in a visible decision box instead, the same item is far more likely to be accurately, confidently discarded, because a week of not missing something is far better evidence than a single anxious moment of uncertainty ever could be. That is rule number 3. Now, rule number 4, and this addresses a category of clutter that exists purely because of how much is displayed at once. Rule number 4. Off-season and infrequently used items are stored entirely out of the main living space, rotated in only when actually needed. Most homes keep the majority of their belongings visible and accessible year-round, regardless of how frequently they're actually used. Every piece of seasonal clothing, every occasional use item, permanently occupying space in the main living area whether it's been touched in the last month or not. Here's the mechanism. The total volume of visible, accessible objects in a space is one of the strongest direct drivers of both perceived clutter and actual daily disorganization. A home doesn't need to contain fewer total possessions to feel and function less cluttered. It needs fewer possessions visible and competing for the same limited daily use space at any given time. Traditional Japanese homes, working within genuinely limited space, have long practiced structured rotation, seasonal clothing and items stored away in dedicated storage, then rotated into the living space only during the season they're actually needed, meaning the volume of objects genuinely competing for attention and space at any one time stays a fraction of the household's total belongings. The shift, the same total number of possessions, with off-season and infrequently used items rotated entirely out of view rather than kept permanently displayed, reduces the functional volume of clutter your daily life actually has to navigate, without requiring you to give up or discard a single item you'd genuinely rather keep. That is rule number 4. Now, rule number 5, and this rule targets a very specific type of surface that quietly becomes clutter magnets in nearly every home. Rule number 5. Flat surfaces, counters, tables, the tops of furniture, default to empty, treated as a functional rule, not just an aesthetic preference. Nearly every home has at least one surface that has quietly become a permanent landing zone: mail, keys, random objects, accumulating steadily because the surface exists and is convenient, with nothing structurally preventing items from being set there. Here's the mechanism. Once a flat surface accumulates even a small number of items, it crosses a threshold researchers studying environmental cues call a broken windows effect applied to clutter. An already slightly cluttered surface measurably lowers the psychological threshold for adding one more item to it, compared to a surface that's genuinely, visibly empty. A completely empty surface signals, wordlessly, nothing belongs here, and that signal alone measurably reduces the likelihood of the first item being set down at all. The entire accumulation cycle for that specific surface never gets the chance to start. The shift, the same countertop or table, deliberately, consistently kept at 0 items rather than allowed to accumulate a few things, never crosses the threshold where additional clutter starts to feel normal. The empty default is doing active, ongoing prevention work, not simply describing a temporarily tidy moment. That is rule number 5. Now, rule number 6, and this one addresses clutter that enters the home without ever having been purchased at all. Rule number 6. Incoming mail and gifts are triaged immediately upon arrival, not set aside to be dealt with later. Purchases aren't the only source of new objects entering a home. Mail, packaging, and gifts arrive continuously, and because they weren't actively chosen the way a purchase was, they're even more likely than a purchase to be set aside to deal with later rather than immediately triaged. Here's the mechanism. This is the same deferred decision problem from Rule 2, applied to items that arrive passively rather than through active choice, and research on decision deferral suggests passively received items are actually more vulnerable to indefinite postponement than actively chosen ones, precisely because there was no initial moment of decision-making engagement with the item at all. A stack of unopened mail, growing daily, isn't really many small decisions being postponed, it's one large, vague, increasingly intimidating task being avoided, which is exactly the profile of task most likely to never actually get done. Triaging immediately, opened, sorted, and either kept, filed, or discarded the moment it arrives, keeps each item as the small, quick decision it actually is, rather than allowing it to merge into an increasingly daunting backlog. The shift, the same volume of mail and incoming items, triaged the moment they arrive instead of set aside into a growing pile, stays a series of small, quick decisions rather than becoming one large, avoided task, the difference between managing clutter in seconds per item versus eventually needing an entire afternoon to catch up on all of it at once. That is rule number 6. Now, rule number 7, the underlying principle tying all 6 of the above together. Stay here, because this is the most important thing in this entire video. Rule number 7. Clutter is always intercepted at one of 3 entry points: the door, the mailbox, or the shopping cart, never dealt with after it's already settled into the home. This last rule isn't a separate practice. It's the single organizing principle behind everything covered so far, and understanding it changes where you should actually be focusing your effort from this point forward. Here's what I mean. Rules 1 and 2 intercept clutter at the shopping cart, the moment of purchase and the hours immediately after. Rule 3 intercepts genuinely ambiguous items with a structured delay rather than letting them settle in permanently by default. Rule 4 manages volume by controlling what's rotated through the door at all. Rule 5 removes the passive landing zones that let anything which does slip past the other rules take root. Rule 6 intercepts everything arriving through the mailbox before it ever has the chance to become a growing, avoided pile. Every single rule on this list operates at one of exactly 3 entry points into your home. Nothing here is about cleaning up clutter after it's already established itself. This is the actual difference between dancery as an ongoing philosophy and decluttering as a periodic event. A big decluttering weekend addresses everything that's already made it past all 3 entry points, undetected, over months or years. These 7 rules address the entry points themselves, which means, done consistently, there's dramatically less that ever needs a big decluttering weekend to fix in the first place. The shift, you don't need to get better at cleaning up clutter after it's already accumulated in your home. You need to watch 3 specific entry points: what comes through the door, what comes through the mail, and what goes in the cart, because that's where all 7 of these rules are actually operating, and it's a far smaller, far more manageable job than sorting through years of accumulation ever will be. That is rule number 7. Here is everything in one breath. Nothing enters your home without a predetermined place to live. New items are placed within 24 hours, never left in a temporary spot. Genuinely undecided items go in a visible 1-week decision box before permanent storage. Off-season items are rotated out of the main living space entirely. Flat surfaces default to empty, as a functional rule, not just a tidy moment. Incoming mail and gifts are triaged immediately upon arrival. And every single one of these rules operates at one of exactly 3 entry points: the door, the mailbox, or the cart, never after clutter has already settled in. 7 rules. None of them require a weekend decluttering marathon or a single donation trip you don't already want to make. Every single one begins at your very next purchase, your next piece of mail, your next item crossing your threshold. Your home isn't cluttered because you don't clean often enough. It's cluttered because nobody ever told you the actual mess starts at 3 specific, identifiable points, and every hour spent cleaning up after the fact is an hour spent on a problem these 7 rules would have prevented from happening in the first place. So here's what I want from you before you close this video. Right now, tell me in the comments which one of these 7 your home is most missing. Is it number 1, do you regularly buy things with no idea where they'll actually live once they're home? Is it number 5, is there a surface in your home right now that's quietly become a permanent landing zone for random items? Is it number 6, is there a pile of unopened mail somewhere that's been growing for weeks? Tell me the number, 1 through 7, in the comments right now, because naming it is the first step, and someone reading your comment might recognize their own entry points in it and finally decide to watch them starting today. If this changed how you think about clutter, send it to the one person you know who's done a dozen big decluttering weekends and always ends up right back where they started. They're 7 small rules away from finally understanding why. I'll see you in the next one.